To our guests who joined us for the first session and are continuing with us for the second part of the ASEAN Power Grid discussion series, thank you very much. We also warmly welcome those joining us for panel two, titled From Pipeline to Bankable Project, Financing the ASEAN Power Grid. In the first session, we explored the broader progress of ASEAN Power Grid projects and gained insights into where some of the stumbling blocks could be and potential solutions thereof and initial financing challenges. In this session, we will take a deeper dive into the financing topic, focusing on what is needed to move projects from pipeline to bankability and ultimately towards implementation. I'd now like to invite our moderator, Mr. Daniel Wiedmer, Director of the Infrastructure Finance Division at the Private Sector Operations Department of ADB, to introduce our distinguished panelists. Over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Yushiro. And for the introduction, good morning to our distinguished panelists, guests, and colleagues. A warm welcome to everyone joining us for this session on financing the ASEAN Power Grid. Before I introduce our essential esteemed lineup of speakers, please be reminded that you can submit your questions to the WOVA app and under your session page. The title of today's session is displayed on the screen. It is my honor to welcome our panelists on the stage. First, we have Mr. Pek Kamkanist, otherwise known as Kun Pek, founder and executive of Impact Electrons Siam. He is the driving force behind the development and success of the 600 megawatt monsoon wind power project, ASEAN's largest and first cross-border wind farm, which reached COD in 2025, big milestone. And he has been innovating in the sector for a long time, including the first solar project in Thailand, which was also ADB's first solar project, which we financed together. Let us also welcome Mr. Eduardo Carlin, Director of Commercial Development at Singapore Energy Interconnections, SGEI. SGEI is a government-appointed company tasked with developing Singapore's cross-border electricity interconnectors. He has over 15 years of experience in the energy infrastructure sector, having worked and advised large-scale projects across Asia-Pacific, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, which is the whole world. Next, we have Mr. Miguel de Jesus, Managing Director and the Chief Operating Officer of ASEAN, Philippines Development and Operation. ASEAN Corporation, part of the Ayala Group, is Philippines' renewable energy developer, builder, operator, and has a presence in Australia, Vietnam, India, and Laos. The company has around 7 gigawatts of attributable renewable energy across projects. And prior to joining ASEAN, Miguel practiced law with a focus on energy and project finance. The Ayala Group is also ADB's largest client in the Philippines, and we have supported them not only with 7 loans, I think already, not only in the Philippines, but also in Vietnam and Laos, including the monsoon project, where they're a key investor. Lastly, please welcome to the stage Mr. Ganesh Padamamban, Managing Director and Head of Project Finance at DBS Bank. He has been with DBS Bank since 2014 and brings over 25 years of banking experience. Throughout his career, he worked in advisory and arranging roles on deals across power, telecommunications, port, oil and gas sectors in various regions. Ganesh currently advises clients on renewable energy, LNG to power, cross-border transmission infrastructure, which is key, cross-border infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, gas midstream, green molecules projects across the Asia-Pacific region. Unfortunately, Ms. Cincin Chanandra from PT Alamtri Group Indonesia was not able to join us the last minute. So Thank you, everybody, for joining us again. Let us begin with the discussion. APG cross-border transmission projects are increasingly becoming mainstream infrastructure assets rather than a niche market. At the same time, stakeholders continue to have differing view and definitions of what makes a project bankable or investable. Hence, I'd like to ask Ganesh, what is holding APG transmission line and cross-border export projects back from reaching financial close? What can the banking community do collectively to overcome these challenges?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm a bit nervous because Jackie just relegated me to number 2. So I'm a bit nervous about speaking when Yuichiro is around. And then we have the goat of project finance, which is Jackie sitting right in front. But nevertheless, I will give it a try. So I did something interesting while I was preparing for this. If you put bankability into an AI chatbot, and I used Claude, and if you look at the results, it says a project is bankable when its risk return profile is structured such that lenders are comfortable extending credit, either on a non-recourse or limited recourse basis. But I want to stretch this a bit further, and I think Asad also mentioned this, and maybe Kunpek will also agree with this. It is not, bankability shouldn't just be limited to lenders alone. Bankability is an issue for sponsors as well, because if you ask a sponsor or a developer, will you invest in a project which is not bankable? The answer is going to be no, because these are infrastructure projects tend to be long duration. You need credit or lending, which forms almost 70, 80% of the capital to make the whole capital stack work as well. And this also boils down to returns. So in that sense, then we need to then look at the risk return profile. What's in it for lenders and what's in it for the sponsors? And that is how we would look at bankability. The question then boils down to, as a first test, most lenders will look at a smell test. Is the sponsor good enough for the project that we are trying to finance, right? And that will always be the primary question that any bank will need to answer, saying, how good is the sponsor? What is his experience? What is his financial wherewithal? Has he done projects of this nature? So on and so forth. So that will be the first question that most lenders, before even undertaking any kind of diligence or anything of that sort. Then it comes down to cross-border projects. And I think because the topic is more on transmission, we should think about a few key gating items, right? And I will point out 3 key issues which I think need to be addressed. The first is the construction risk, because these tend to be really long gestation projects and the development cycle tends to be extended period of time. Then it is a question about pinning down what is the capital cost, how much is the clearances that the project has managed to get from various countries, what kind of intergovernmental approvals are needed, what is the kind of support mechanisms that the governments can provide, and so on and so forth. So mixed into this whole completion risk or the construction risk comes in the political risk aspect as well, which is where the second issue arises. Third, as any banker would tell you, cash flow will form the basis of any financing. So revenue certainty and cash flow certainty is key to make sure that the projects are bankable. And this is where the revenue model for interconnectors becomes key to make sure that these are bankable. I'll pause here perhaps and then also invite other participants to see if they have any contributions to this as well.
Thank you, Ganesh. So we heard about the challenges of reaching financial close, but we've also recently seen successful examples of cross-border energy projects. So Kunpek, looking across the entire development and financing journey, how can the Monsoon deal serve as a template for other APG corridors? Which features were unique to Monsoon and to the Laos-Vietnam context? Based on your experience, how transferable is the monsoon structure to other APG markets, and what aspects can be replicated and what challenges remain market specific?
Thank you. I don't think it can be replicated. But anyway, I want to comment. I checked ChatGPT on who's the guru of project finance, and Jackie's pictures come up. So we have been locking doors with Jackie for 3 days to close monsoon. And it's, for us, I think from pipeline to bankable project, we actually did the reverse. We tried to do bankable project, and then we built pipeline on top of that. And I think that's what we learned from monsoon is so much that we learned. Again, I think the monsoon has all the key bankability. We learn as we go. I think one is we went to EVN with open mind and a bit naive. We tell them we want to do this international bankable with ADB as our lead arranger. Now, what we ask is a lot. I think we want US dollar payment offshore. We want English law. We want Singapore arbitration. We want termination payment. We want change in law protection. And we want deemed generation on completion guarantee on the transmission line. Now, how do we get that done? We told them we will deliver the cheapest power to Vietnam. We will strengthen the grid of Vietnam by putting power in the middle of the country where you reduce 1,000 kilometers of loss. We give you complementary in the central area that you have a lot of hydro, and our southern wind is predominantly dry season. So it has a lot component to get to where we get to. So I think it has to be tailor-made in terms of how do we finance the cross-border project. I think I stopped there. There's so many things in my mind, but I let
thing to remember also, Kunpek, is I think during that journey, when you talk to EVN, we had many debates on what is the absolute must-have. And I think that's part of the role that bankers play as they go and work with sponsors much before they approach the general market, just to say, let's look down, what can we isolate as the must-haves, and then give EVN all the rest.
But I think from ADB is never one must-have. You have many must-have. I'm kidding. But I think that the team.
I just wanted to add on to this, but it's very. I wouldn't say that you can completely take monsoon and replicate that across multiple projects. It's never going to happen, because you go to any country and say, I want the monsoon structure replicated, you're going to get a pushback. Because I think Director Kanchana also presented that in these cost projects, the fiscal capacity of each of these ASEAN countries or Southeast Asia countries is very different. And it's only Singapore which has the fiscal capacity to bear this high cost of renewable power. And that's why Singapore essentially is leading this whole transition story. If that is indeed the case, then can EVN continue to support multiple projects like monsoon, because they will soon run out of fiscal capacity as well. And this is not just wind alone, because wind tends to be single instead of single technology. We have offshore wind, which tends to be very expensive, and Director mentioned about offshore wind in Vietnam as well. So the question then is, how do we bring that generation from the country which has the resource to a country which can pay for it, which is where the complications are.
Sorry.
Saying you're expensive.
Oh, really?
Are you expensive? Is this the?
It depends on which country. Cost is expensive. Like for me, it might not be expensive for, I don't know, other might be expensive. But just to comment on, I think we see that happen. So there's 6 gigawatt of wind offered to Vietnam cross-border. But, I mean, ASEAN, I think you involved as well. We talk a lot about it. But the new developer doesn't want English law, doesn't want Singapore arbitration, doesn't want US dollars. Now, how's the bankable, community, or the bank community to make that bankable? I think that would be a challenge. For us, I think our next project platform Yes, we take a knowledge from Monsoon. What we want to build is stable, firm green energy. So that's why we're going for our pipeline.
I think leads very neatly to Eduardo to talk more about the regulatory issues. And one observation, just I think, which is what we observe when we look at the bankability in terms of law, etc. There is an inverse correlation between track record of the off-taker and the maturity of the legal system and whether we need English law or not. So, for example, if you have a very good track record, if you have for decades, like EGAT, for example, to mention something outside Singapore, we don't need English law as bankers, right? So and we are okay with local arbitration or ERC regulations, etc. So there is, but if there's less track records, then it's not bankable. So I think that, and we have seen also countries mature. They started with English law, and then over time, the PPA, etc., started to be with local law. So with this, I'd like to ask Eduardo, from Singapore's perspective, what are the most important commercial and regulatory elements that need to be in place for an import project to achieve bankability? So if you look at Singapore's import framework, which continues to evolve rapidly, with multiple cross-border projects at different stages of development. So if you could comment on that, would be very interesting.
I would say the number one element to make these projects viable is government-to-government alignment. I think everything else will be a consequence of that alignment. And ultimately, when you're talking about interconnectors, cross-border projects, you're looking at sovereign projects. You're looking at transmission lines that are going to go through territorial waters and that are going to have an impact in each of the various domestic power systems. So without that government-to-government alignment, and that was mentioned in the previous panel, it's very difficult for projects to realize. Having said that, I think we're now going through a very interesting phase where there is momentum. There has been progress that probably hasn't been seen since the APG discussions kicked off 20, 30 years ago. And a good example of that is the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power integration project, which started off with 100 megawatts, then went up to 200 megawatts. And that's a demonstration of strong willingness across different stakeholders. Now, the challenge to make more cross-border projects viable is, to your point, Daniel, to have some sort of harmonization across the different systems. And this is not an easy task to do, because if you look at every individual electricity market in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, they all have very different, very different characteristics. So, for example, comparing Singapore to Indonesia, on one hand, you have Indonesia, whose electricity market is formed in a way whereby you have certain parts of the market monopolized by a single government-owned utility. Whereas in Singapore, you have the other, you're on the other spectrum where it's a very liberalized market. So how do you essentially harmonize different power systems? How do you make sure that there is coordination for dispatch? And that's something that can only be overcome through a very strong government-to-government alignment. Once that takes place, I think the other elements of the project tend to smoothen out. And to Ganesh's point, for the projects to be viable, there needs to be foreseeable cash flows. That means offtake, whether it be corporate offtake or government-backed offtake. There needs to be some sort of clarity with regards to the regulatory frameworks. Again, as I mentioned earlier, dispatch, grid compliance, And then you need the certainty on risk allocation, because what happens if a project on one side of the border is curtailed for one reason, and who's responsible for that? And likewise, if the project is curtailed on the other side of the border, who will take responsibility for that? So the risk allocation across the various stages of the project, development, construction, operations, is critical.
Thank you. It's very interesting. As you mentioned, the G2G relationship is so important and could be even G2G to G. And so for the ASEAN Power Grid, ADB is involved not just, of course, as you have heard also this morning, not just on the banking side, but also on the facilitating this G2G relationship. And that's why ADB has actually now a new group, which is specifically for the ASEAN Power Grid, which is headed by Scott, who's sitting so close to the panel that I think I can include him. So how does ADB intend to facilitate this G2G dialogue?
Thanks for the impromptu question. 3 levels. One is working at the company and project level, making sure that whatever is being proposed by sponsors for our support is woven into the development plans of the country, and making sure that there's full alignment there, and that we're able to use that relationship with the government to ensure that the right rules are in place to support the investment. The second is at the sub-regional and regional level. We're honored to play a role either as secretariat for sub-regional fora. The GMS is probably the most advanced, but also at the ASEAN level through our reporting of our activities through the finance track and the other tracks. But then the last is to really work directly in partnership with ASEAN. And at the end of last year at the Energy Ministers meeting in October, together with the ASEAN Center for Energy, the ASEAN Secretariat, and the World Bank, we launched the ASEAN Power Grid Financing Initiative, the purpose of which is really to make sure that we're using the collective strengths of these 4 organizations to mobilize interest, to coordinate our actions, and to surface to the ASEAN bodies and tracks the financing perspective. So making sure that the points that are being raised in sessions like today, but also at the project investment level, are reaching the right decision makers. This is the sort of things that are done in public, I would say, jointly, that we're recording statements on behalf of the group. Of course, as a development actor, we're always working behind the scenes to make sure that in the right way, the messages are reinforced through, I think, sometimes a little bit more of a confidential give and take.
Thank you very much, Scott. And now I'd like to talk about risks and bring the conversation to Miguel. So ASEAN operates across multiple jurisdictions. You really have a broad portfolio with very different regulatory and political environments. So what is the biggest risk that fundamentally changes when a project becomes cross-border, and how does that shape your internal go or no-go decisions?
First of all, thank you for having me this morning. It's interesting listening on this panel because I myself was not involved in the Monsoon project. I was watching it from afar, but we helped fund it, yes, work through the pipe on that. But when I think through your question, I think we just should start by whether it's a cross-border project or not. The fundamentals of a utility scale power project are the same, right? It's offtake certainty, it's transmission, it's curtailment, it's land rights, and so on and so forth. And when I think through ASEAN's journey over the last few years, it's probably worthwhile to put in context the way we characterize risk. You have to remember that the first projects we were building were on the first feed-in tariff projects within the Philippines in 2014. And at that time, it was the very, very first one. It was the wind project. And maybe this framed our point of view of risk, but the very first project we had to build was a project up in the north of the Philippines, Pagudpud, with a 60-kilometer transmission line to the first substation, Lawag, which had grid problems further down because it's a radial asset. So that was the first project that we built. So everything after that was better, if you had to put it in perspective. The moment our project got built, it was grid curtailed. So we were living with that as a risk. So when we were starting to look at moving into other jurisdictions, particularly Vietnam, where we went in with a gigawatt of capacity, even before we did monsoon, it was already in that same context, thinking through the risks there. At least there was more certain that there was, when we had to look at the EVN risk, it was in the context of how we would look at the feed-in tariff risk in the Philippines. When we'd have to look at curtailment risk, it was also in that same context. So finally, when you come to monsoon, in fact, you got a good deal. When I think about the bankability parameters, as you said, that you had insisted on coming into the project itself. It's a horrible deal, no, but comparable to some of the other risks that we had to look at for our projects. And we were building a lot of projects in south of Vietnam where there was significant curtailment risk. And we were dealing with cross-border financing as well. So I think it's just a matter of scale, a matter of scale or a matter of complexity, but the fundamentals remain the same. And I think the one maybe differentiator will be, because the transmission line will have to move through separate jurisdictions, it'll be ownership of risk on each side of that jurisdiction. That might be the one probably single nuance that I think would differentiate fundamentally. I don't know if Beck would agree.
I want to comment that we really enjoy working with ASEAN on this project. I think they understand development, they understand risk, and they don't panic. So on the transmission line, I think Kunat here, our CEO of Monsoon, I think give credit to him on the 18-month long negotiation with EVN on the PPA and the delivery of Monsoon for 4 months ahead of the budget. What we find is we connect to the 500 kV backbone of Vietnam, and we own transmission line 500 kV to the border of Laos, and Vietnam's built to connect. We have been operating since 22nd August, and I think our curtailment has been less than expected, I think around maybe less than 1% overall. I think that we have done a lot of grid impact study before we talk to the lenders, and we have a lot of study. We look at what could curtail, what every generation on the north, on the south. So I think it gave us a lot of discipline when you go to project finance, especially non-recourse one with ADB.
As we turn to the bank's views, I think I'd like to add something from ADB's banking view, is that we should never forget the realities on the ground. So there is, of course, the legal context, and which is very important. Can they call for curtailment? What is it compensated for? Not exactly. Is it technical or not? So all these legal points. But for us, when we financed Monsoon, the fact that it was connected directly to the backbone, the 500 kV line of Vietnam, was crucial. That's because that is a fact, right? So what is the interest and to curtail this project? It's a different story. And so with this, I would like to ask the perspective of commercial banks. Ganesh, what is the biggest impact on your credit assessment? Leave it open, a question like this.
All right, thank you. And I mentioned revenue certainty when we talked about our cash flow certainty when we spoke about it. But maybe we'll put this in context as well. The first thing is you have the Google, Meta, Amazon as off-takers. Now these users are willing to pay a fixed price, a cap. They don't have infinite capacity to absorb the costs. Assuming that they pay a fixed price for the power which is delivered to them. And of course, I believe Asad when he says solar and wind manufacturing has got to an extent where the prices have been compressed and they've achieved really great economies of scale on the production capacity, and it's true in that sense. And that's happened because China has surplus capacity. Globally, there's a huge supply of solar and capacity in the world. So the generation cost itself has also been brought down substantially. Then it boils down to the interconnectors. The interconnectors, there are two elements that we can think about. One is the absolute cost of the interconnector. And I think if you believe the Prismian gentleman, there is a reasonable capacity match with the timeline that these projects need to be delivered. In my mind, I think that's not enough because there needs to be an aggressive build-up for cost to be brought down. Obviously, you have the elemental costs of copper and so on and so forth, which are also going through the roof as well. So that is outside the control of banks as well or the developers. Then lastly, it comes to the question, and which Daniel asked, saying, what is the return that lenders are expecting, and what is the return sponsors are expecting as well? And these are the two elements which will then bring down the cost of the transmission as well as the generation as well. Now, this is where the delicate dance of risk allocation comes into play, which Eduardo mentioned as well. So the stakeholders to this whole discussion then are the two governments, the developer, lenders, and the other participants and insurance and other risk takers in the project as well. Which is where I think each of the risk elements need to be carefully calibrated, and there needs to be an agreement on who takes the risk. So for example, if we take curtailment risks, that if the sponsors are not willing to take, the lenders are not willing to take, right? And if you put this risk onto the lenders and sponsors, they will price it up. Your cost goes up. But the governments are the best place to actually take on these risks. And if the governments then step in to say, okay, we share these risks and make sure that the project doesn't suffer the curtailment, then that provides an effective mitigation for lenders then to say, yes, on this basis, I'm willing to go, provided or even sponsors. The second element is obviously, again, you need to go through each step or each element. And this is the work that we've been doing with a lot of the developers and we've been advising on a couple of projects as well. In each of these risk elements, then there needs to be an apportionment as well. We are working on a project which then goes across interconnector project and which Director Kanchana also mentioned, which transcends 2-3 countries. It starts in Malaysia, goes through Indonesia and lands into Singapore as well. Now, here the issue is around what happens to the transit country. And if the transit country doesn't come to the party and support the construction of the project or the O&M also of the project also, because the undersea cables need to be operated, need to be maintained, you need to provide vessel permitting, you need to provide them access and so on and so forth. Now, those are risks which neither the sponsor nor the lenders will be willing to take, because and that is where the critical element of government to government agreements need to come in and step in and say that two governments should then agree to say that as the developer, as the O&M operator, both will be allowed to access the project and maintain this for the benefit of the project itself. So it is not a straightforward answer. It's a very long-winded answer to the question, but I think it boils down to looking at the risk register and then apportioning that to each of the stakeholders who are supporting the project.
And it just shows the complexity of the issue, right? So there's more than one must-have. Come back. Apologies.
No doubt.
And so let's turn to the public sector perspective, especially given that cross-border interconnection projects involve multi-jurisdictional risks, as we heard, that developers and financiers must price in some ways. So Eduardo, what key risks does SGEI see in these projects, and how is your organization working to mitigate them?
So firstly, I think the establishment of SGI itself is a way that Singapore government is addressing by getting involved in projects early on to make sure that technical commercial viability of these interconnectors can be assessed and where challenges can be overcome early. So I think that's the number one added value that we can bring to the table. And it's something which, for all projects, I think is needed, rather than addressing issues at a later stage during construction operations. If we can address them earlier, that should be done. I would refer to my earlier point on harmonization of technical standards as being a very important element to make these projects successful. It means that, at least from SGI's perspective and Singapore's point of view, we need to work very closely with the key stakeholders in Singapore, which involves the power system operator under the Energy Market Authority, working with the electricity market operator, EMC, and working obviously with Singapore Power Group, which is responsible for the domestic transmission and distribution. And we need to work with them closely to make sure that these projects, once they land into Singapore, they are properly complying with the grid code, and to make sure that the market operator and the system operator can readily adapt to this new flow of electrons. Mind you that looking at Singapore, it's a country whose electricity mix is currently very much reliant on gas-fired power plants. 95% of Singapore's power generation comes from gas-fired power plants. So an inflow of 6 gigawatts of renewable energy, which is the target that Singapore government has set by 2035, will clearly present challenges to the power system. And so this is what we're doing. We need to work early on to foresee issues that might arise 10 years from now, which maybe are not so evident at the moment. And then on the other side of the borders, we need to work with our partners in the other governments to make sure that these projects make sense to them and that there's mutual benefit. And right now, we're seeing very strong momentum, as I mentioned earlier, not only with LTMS, but last year in October, during the ASEAN Minister of Energy meeting, we signed a joint development agreement with TNB and Singapore Power Group to develop the second interconnector between Malaysia and Singapore, adding on to the already existing one. So again, with them, we're working now alongside TNB and SP Group to undertake a feasibility study so that we can again address any issues upfront and make sure that once these projects are operational, they can smoothly transmit electrons.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And going back to Khun Pek and your experience, so we have seen that cross-border power projects often face roadblocks due to misaligned sovereign and regulatory frameworks, as well as differing views among local stakeholders and project champions. So in Monsoon's case, what form of government-to-government alignment was most critical for the success? What was most challenging in terms of this G2G or stakeholder alignment? How did you herd the cats?
I think our secret is to keep low profile. I tell you, this is the most important. And I think the G2G government between Laos and Vietnam is very important. If you remember in 2014 when we start going over to Vietnam, the megawatt that was committed in the G2G is a lot, I think. It's but no project has been proposed. I think before us it's only some hydro, small hydros, and we proposed our wind project, 600 megawatt, and it was very confusing at the time because it's a wind. No one heard of that Laos has wind, so we need to explain that wind is similar to hydro with renewable, green, and the challenge was, can you do 6.95, same as hydro? I said, let's try. Right? From that day to today, 8,000 megawatt is actually full and now exceeding 8,000 megawatt. That G2G and the project that has been proposed under that G2G is now more than 8,000 megawatt. Now, I think this is a different issue now, like which project is real? So, you know, I think you asked our first question, should this be copied, the monsoon, the template for it? I think, I don't know you want to copy it. It take us 14 years, only 14 years to bring the idea to commercial operations. But during that 14 years, we learned a lot, you know. It's a journey that I think one of the questions you're going to ask next is, would we do it again, right? I tell you today, yes, I would do it again. But if I sit on the 27th December 2022, when we got 3 days to close financing and we have one permit we need to get from Vietnam and we couldn't get it, we have to put equity fund before financing close, 95 million US. That's a tough call. But you know, with good partners like we have, and sometimes, you know, you need a lot of luck, but and you need determination, and you got to believe what you believe to get it done. So I don't know. I answer your.
No, you did. And since you already on the topic, almost, I'd like to ask you how. I mean, on the next topic, what would you do differently?
I don't know. I think we happy where we are. I think what we do differently is our next project will not be the same as the last one. Always like that. Because one, we the first mover, people copies, and then it become race to the bottom. So we need to keep innovate, keep offer a better solution for ASEAN, I think. So is that good?
Continue to innovate. It's great.
The correct answer is we would work with DBS.
and ASEAN. Oh, we've been rejected. Sorry.
No, this continuous innovation is what makes Kunpek the most interesting power company or developer to talk to. In the sense of there's always something visionary that humbles us just by the innovation and how to say that you're always 10 years ahead, and that's great. So to ask Miguel, so from ASEAN's perspective, again on the same the topic of regulatory volatility, G2G, how can MDBs help to reduce the uncertainty premium from the ABG related projects, and just more broadly, how do you see those premiums and what can boost investor confidence?
But I think first, just to sort of speak through our portfolio, because we're invested across very different jurisdictions with very, very different risk profiles. And going back to something Ganesh was saying, when you look at it from a total appreciation of the risks per project, it varies significantly from one jurisdiction to the next. So coming back to your question, there's always a perspective that if you're able to bring in MDBs or DFIs, and you could potentially address some of the regulatory risk premia associated with a project. And I recall when we were doing this specifically in Vietnam for the first wave of Vietnam projects, and that's why I come back to saying that in some respects, Kunpek's project is a little bit more ideal than the first feed-in tariff projects that we had entered into in Vietnam. There were certain risks to the Vietnam feed-in tariff originally, which we found there was a lot of apprehension from not only MDBs, but also even foreign banks. And we had to rely on some of our own local banking relationships in the Philippines. And in fact, at one point, I think had one of our partners was probably one of the largest lenders into Vietnam for the first wave of projects, just sort of to get them across the line. So, I wish, I wish there was a straightforward answer to say that if we were to have an ADB or an IFC or whomever it might be as a lender for that project, necessarily we would be able to undo some of the terms of the feed-in tariff. So I thought you had a great answer coming in, that you sort of like mandated that if I'm going to bring in these lenders at this scale, then these are the parameters of that offtake contract that need to be put in place. And that's probably the right way to think about it, that the involvement of the lenders has to be from the very, very onset when structuring the offtake contract, the allocation of risk. So it's very, very clear from the very, very beginning that if you want to bring in these lenders with this cost of capital or whatnot, and you want your price to precisely be as low as it might be, then they'll have to be able to be involved in the crafting of the fundamental terms.
Thank you very much. And similar question to Ganesha, what do you, from your point of view, what do you think are those critical factors to look at risk premiums, etc., as it relates to interconnection?
I think pretty much what we spoke about thus far, and I agree with Miguel in the sense that if lenders are involved right from the onset, then there are two benefits. There is a level of diligence that the lenders bring to the process. Then the sponsors might be in a position to unearth risks which were not discovered earlier, in sense which wasn't very apparent earlier, right? So that's one. The second element is obviously the lenders, as I said at the beginning, lenders work very closely with the sponsors. So the ability of the sponsors to position, and the lenders can then support the sponsors to position a project which then appeals to a wider set of lenders as well. To bring in that huge liquidity is where the sponsors make a big difference in crafting the right project, crafting the right risk allocation, and making sure that this is attractive proposition. It's probably, in my view, it's not purely about price alone, because lenders will work on a least common denominator as far as the risk is concerned, which is what bankability is all about. But it then boils down to what incremental stuff that sponsors can bring to the project, which then makes the project much more viable.
Interesting. And it's like this saying, no bank has been brought down because of pricing.
That's true. Yeah.
It's about the risks.
I need to write that down.
And maybe a question that's a little bit more technical to Eduardo. As Singapore increases its share of imported renewable energy, what are the key systems integration challenges SGI is preparing for, particularly around intermittency, reserve requirements, and grid stability? And those, of course, relate to bankability, but the smart regulator can de-risk it through the facts.
So, as I mentioned earlier, if you take the Singapore electricity market as is today, it's 95% power generation from gas-fired power plants. So once you have 6 gigawatts of imported power coming online, that has a direct impact on how the system operator will need to react, how the grid operator will need to handle things, and how the market operator will need to function at that point. Now, all of these elements go beyond SGI's remit, in the sense that our focus is primarily on the interconnector itself. But having said that, one of the main roles that we play is to precisely come into projects early and identify the commercial technical challenges, including the ones that you've just mentioned, Daniel, and try to work with the relevant stakeholders in order to overcome any issues that we might see as the main risks once these projects come online. Looking at how we will need to get ready for this, there is a lot of coordination that is required. And this coordination goes back to my first point in this discussion, which is the government-to-government alignment. We need to have very strong government-to-government alignments to make sure that we don't bump into insurmountable problems, with obviously the Singapore grid being an absolute priority for us, and to make sure that there is full stability even once these projects come online. And the final remark I would make on this is we also need to differentiate quite a lot between grid-to-grid interconnectors, like the one between Peninsular Malaysia and Singapore, which I mentioned earlier is currently being planned to be expanded through a second interconnector. And then there are the plant-to-grid interconnectors, which are the ones where you have a single project having a dedicated interconnector going into Singapore. There are very different aspects to those two types of interconnectors. So again, the best way to avoid problems is to identify them at the earliest stage possible and work with the relevant stakeholders to overcome them and make sure all of the mitigation plans are enacted.
Very much, Eduardo. And before we go to the questions from the audience, I have something that I always do when I'm moderating a panel. I'd like to ask the panelists to ask a question to each other, if you have one.
I don't have one.
Okay, excellent. If anyone has a question, just to give you an opportunity to ask each other.
I'll take the opportunity to throw a question to Ganesh, but I guess it's also to you, Daniel, and to the lenders, of course. So, I mean, if you have to look at the state of play of the interconnector projects that are most advanced at the moment in ASEAN, and that can be into Singapore, but also elsewhere if you're working on other projects. If you had to point out the single biggest risk and potential mitigant, what would it be?
So I think when we look at this type of projects, it's usually the interconnection is part of a bigger project, right? So in that sense, I think it is key to make sure that it doesn't disrupt the cash flow to the actual renewable energy generation project, and to include it as much as possible in the project finance structure. Or if it is not included, to make sure that the point of responsibility for the project stops at that earlier stage. So I think that's really to have clarity on what is part of the project risk and what is not, and if the interconnection is where does it sit, and then to have that point of payment of responsibility beyond the interconnection if it's not part of the project.
If there's one thing which I'd pick, I'd say it's the revenue model, because that revenue model reflects the underlying risk allocation, whether it's a availability-based payment, whether it is going to be a cap and flow, whether it's going to be on a merchant basis, whatever else. And I think the revenue models, it's not enough to simply say that we are going to copy what the European playbook, because what works in Europe probably doesn't fully align with what Asia can adopt or ASEAN can adopt. So I think it's good to look at the European model, but we need to adapt for Asia, because I think the point has been made multiple times. Fiscal capacities of each of the countries around ASEAN is not the same, which is where, and there may not be surplus power to be traded across countries. So there has to be an alignment of interest between various countries. So my vote is on revenue model.
Thank you. Any other question to each other, just in case?
Something Eduardo was referring to briefly earlier, just about the change in the the off-takers. We're starting to see that a lot of the offtake is now moving away from long-term PPA arrangements to retail offtake models in different jurisdictions, right? And I think we just have to recognize that that's probably more of what we're going to see moving forward. So the question to the banks, what would it take to get the banks comfortable providing up to 70% leverage on a retail model?
Actually, we financed one of for ASEAN. We did a battery project in Australia, and that battery was contracted to a gentailer. And the gentailer then in Australia, they have both generation and retail companies. So that's one experience that we have had. So what happens is that the gentailer then also benefits from having its own generation, which can be traded. Plus, they have a big retail book, which de-risks their generation as well. But if you look at it from the Singapore context, Singapore has had a history of retailers failing. And this happened after the Ukraine issue because the retailers had contracted tariffs with consumers, but the purchase price of the bulk power just went up. So all of them had to buy expensive power to supply to retailers who were paying really low prices, and a couple of them actually went bankrupt. So this is where the whole aversion, or rather the risk perception of retailers arise in the minds of banks itself. But having looked at these two contexts itself, I would say the banks look at different markets quite differently. Asia is a largely contracted, as you said, utility contracted PPA market dominated by banks. And in the Philippines, it's a merchant market, but there are large retailers who have a significant consumer base, and they can then de-risk the offtake for banks itself. So in my mind, there is not a single solution which or a leverage that I can put on any particular project. It boils down to the individual case by case in terms of who the offtaker is and what is the credit enhancement or the credit quality of that offtaker itself. What is the payment risk? Because we bear in mind that the construction is 2 years, but the project has to run for 20 years. So banks are actually taking a call that this retailer is not going to go down for the next 20 years, and which is not an easy one.
And I'd like to open the question to the audience. So please, yeah.
Leong Yuan Yung from Malaysia. My question is for PAC. How did you build trust for the monsoon project? And over the long 14 years, what was the most significant trust crisis that you faced, and how did you overcome that?
Can we both answer? Okay. Trust.
I take the first question, and then you can think about the second question. To build trust takes time. That's why we're there in Laos since 2011. You know, one farmer with a gun can stop the project. So the trust with the local people is the most important thing. So aligning our social aspects with ADB Safeguard, I think we go beyond that on social. Trust starts from the very bottom, from the villages, from local people, from local governments, from provinces, up to the ministers, ministries, prime ministers, all level. That's why it took 14 years. I think that's the most important trust. So when we operate, we focus on community development, social, on education, on healthcare, on the well-being, hundreds of initiatives from us, 1.1 million every year, straight to the communities. So people really feel it. When you go to our site, people really feel that we bring something good to the community. And when we expand for the future, they're really looking forward for our future projects.
On the banking side, I think we gain trust from ADB, I think they are the first to believe in us. I think back in 2014, early, and with ADB kind of help us along the way, like Jackie example. That's kind of gain trust for a company like us. We want to do something better for the community. I listened to Mr. Asad, we just left. He said his paycheck reflect on how good the environment and social we do. I think could not show a great example. I think we learned so much from ADB, biodiversity, social, and that's a good, valuable knowledge. And I just want to tell, but he's not here, our KPI is to be kind, happy, and outstanding on everything we do.
Very much, yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So my name is Ingo Pool. I am a carbon guy. Maybe, yeah, okay. And I think, though, as a carbon guy, I was enjoying listening to you and how difficult it is to move an electron across borders. And I hope I'm not making this conversation more complicated by asking, what about moving the environmental attributes of that power across borders? There's a whole other layer of G2G. What is your experience around that? And also, is it actually important for the project?
We face the same challenge, Igor, because our project is cross-border. And now under gold standard or Vera, there's no such thing, no category for that. We convinced them that you should take this under other category. You should put a framework together. And I think we've been working with them in the past 2 years. Now they visit the site. I think we're at the last advanced stage of being registered. So again, it's take time and trust to when we show them what monsoon is about. And I think we'll let you know whether we achieve that.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, particularly around, for example, renewable energy certificates. So currently in Southeast Asia and within ASEAN, we need to definitely work on having a common system that recognizes cross-border renewable energy certificates. Right now, it's not possible because simply there's a risk, for example, that certain renewable energy certificates be double counted. So I think there's quite a lot of work going on to make sure that we move onto a more harmonized system, similar to, for example, what happens in Europe, whereby you can have someone buying a renewable energy certificate in France, while that electron was generated in Germany, and no one will have any issues with regards to double counting. They know that there's a common system there so ASEAN is moving towards that direction, but there needs some work to be done to get there.
Just the last bit, I think ASEAN is also championing the energy transition as well for one of their coal-fired projects. And Singapore has come up with a novel idea around transition credits as well, because then the CFPP then gets shut down and replaced by a clean energy replacement capacity. We've been working with ASEAN as well. So that's another form where you can actually have the carbon itself getting funded, and this whole transition has to get funded itself through transition.
Yeah, I'm just answer as well. I think their question is really on point, actually. If there's one thing that's worthwhile looking at, I think because there are many things we can deal with which might be further term, but rationalizing the IREC market in Southeast Asia is actually something I think that's probably something worth putting some pressure in. And I think that's one space where MDBs will have an opportunity to kind of drive policy. From experience, we've registered projects under the CDM, we've registered projects under CERs, we've done IREX, we have local REX, which are compliance REX, voluntary REX. There's a whole bunch of attributes, and it depends on who you're talking to, what they want to buy, what sort of interest they have. Your story can change one from the other, but it's obviously not a tenable long-term solution, especially if we're going cross-border, because the interests and where they sit exactly need to be very, very clearly defined. So I would say that's probably one near-term policy initiative that needs to be pushed hard. I know in the Philippines right now, they're trying to make a distinction between compliance RECs and voluntary RECs. Most of the projects that are getting built under these feed-in tariff projects are all supposed to be compliance RECs, which are supposed to be non-tradable. But then a whole bunch of other people want now tradable RECs. And frankly, even when you start to look at into the retail space, there are also retail players which are keen on not necessarily buying local voluntary RECs, but international RECs. So it's an extremely complicated sort of landscape that needs to be mapped out, especially if you really want to be very, very serious about cross-border.
I'd say special award to Ingo. It's the first time ever I've heard a question from the audience where all panelists voluntarily answered. And to add to your glory, anyone in the audience who would like to share the views on the same question? Okay, then let's go to the next question.
Yeah, thank you for an exciting panel. I think very good thoughts shared. I work for a bank, SMBC, and as a bank who is very interested in supporting sustainable growth, financing sustainable growth, and the grid is a very important part of that. My question is, of course, Eduardo, closer to the Singapore government now, so is to you and possibly to Daniel. Obviously, when Singapore is trying to import electricity, there are challenges around engagement with neighbors. I, like Jackie, am an optimist. I think these problems will be solved. The question I have is, as you sit both in one government and probably in a multilateral, how soon do you think, particularly the current challenges can be resolved, particularly with regard to one, the fact that, like what Ganesh said, there is an issue with governments prioritizing their own needs ahead of looking at the region as a whole. And secondly, even in Singapore, the concern around carbon tax, that if we push carbon taxes up too fast, the cost of the economy will go up. But if you don't, imports become less viable. So those are my questions. Thank you.
So on the first point, with regards to the engagement with the other countries, I think there's been a lot of progress made in the last few years. And we at SGI were appointed by the government to work on developing and operating interconnectors, but more specifically, we work alongside the Energy Market Authority on those projects that have had either conditional approvals or conditional licenses issued. And most of these projects are either in Malaysia or in Indonesia. And what I can say is that the engagement is very good with both countries. And I think it's a matter of time before we see these projects up and running. I mean, it can sometimes feel a bit frustrating because obviously the timelines are not exactly what I think all of us working on these projects would like them to be. But if you think about it, just a few years ago, no one was really talking about the issues that we're talking about now. And whilst it can be quite dreadful sometimes to focus on issues, it's also a good sign, meaning that people are working to overcome them. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And that's exactly what I think is taking place across our interactions with the various projects. So I think we'll get there. And so I'm also an optimist from that point of view. With regards to the carbon tax question, I think it's a relevant point. One probably that is very difficult to address here because I think there's so many different considerations to be made. But having said this, if we look at the carbon tax implementation in Singapore, it's quite gradual. So I think hopefully with that gradual approach, there will be sufficient time and buffer to adapt. And I think regardless of the carbon tax, I think that the import projects will be commercially viable and attractive.
I'll just add one quick point. I mean, I've now been at ADB for 22 years, and I've never seen as much momentum on the big players everywhere who want it done. So that includes the governments, that includes also the investors from Asia, also from beyond. So I think that momentum is very likely to lead to something relatively soon.
Thank you for the very interesting panel discussion. I have a question to the group. No? Eduardo mentioned that what is most relevant is to have a G2G set of agreements, because this is going to be pushed by state. But I also heard from Mr. Padmanabhan that what needs to be set is a clear business model. So who is going to pay for? Who is going to cover the cost, and how is this going to be commercially operational? No? I see a clear need for this, and wanted to ask the team, the panel, how do you think this should be addressed in terms of studies, in terms of negotiations, in terms of, yeah.
I'll take a shot at this first, and maybe I'll invite my panelists as well to contribute. I think most of it right now is happening through negotiations, obviously, but there have been studies done on interconnector models around the world, not just in Europe. So we've looked at different parts of, there are interconnectors in Australia, there are interconnectors in Europe, different revenue models. There are interconnectors which are working on under all the different revenue models. So we studied them, understood what applies, and the developers have also studied those. The regulators have studied those, the governments have studied those. So it's happening through a process of negotiation and understanding what fits best for that specific use case. Maybe Eduardo might be able to contribute a bit.
Yeah, maybe the only comment I'd have is that having private sector business models or arrangements isn't necessarily mutually exclusive to government frameworks. In fact, if anything, the government frameworks may set the parameters whereby the private sector comes in and how it comes in. So yeah, that would be my only comment.
So there's no need, based on what I hear from the panel, for a common framework on how to set up these bilateral agreements between the countries, because if there's a single system, trade would be facilitated, having less negotiations, etc. And also, if this is done bilaterally, imagine you have 3 countries in a row. The country on the right would benefit from the agreements between the first and the second country. No? So there are indirect benefits of these bilateral agreements. So the question is whether you think a common framework for our business model or cost recovery model is relevant.
I think if at some point, and I think that's the ultimate end game, is to get to a fully harmonized energy market within ASEAN. I think that's something which will benefit everyone. But the journey to get there needs to go through multiple steps. And I think right now we're looking primarily at bilateral projects, although LTMS goes through a number of different countries, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and then arrive in Singapore. And even if we take the European example, which many times is used as a reference for a common energy market, it took over 50, 60 years for the energy market really to be formed. It started off with once-off bilateral projects, and from there on, in the 50s, things developed further up to a point in the 90s to reach a fully integrated energy market within the European Union. So I think we'll get there in ASEAN as well. And right now, the initiatives on a bilateral basis hopefully will build further momentum to get to a single energy market within ASEAN.
I'll just say, I'll quote a very famous thing, but one of my very close friends said, you need to get one project off the ground. If you try to get 5 projects off and develop a common framework, it will never happen. Yeah, and that person is in this room.
Actually, I heard similar, but different person, right? Could I mention name or shouldn't? But anyway, I think we went to one panel in Malaysia, and I think ACE is presenting 18 projects, right? And then one gentleman from Singapore said that next year Singapore will be ASEAN share, and he said it would be nice if you pick the 3 projects that we can put in an effort to make it happen. For me, I think we need to decide whether it's private-led or is it, like the government-led project. I think that's to be decided. But for us, we just keep going at what we believe. And I think LTMS is a great pathfinder. And I think that could, it's 2 years renewal. I think it's, if you can do it like 25 years, I think that could be beneficial for a long-term real project happening.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jamie. I'm from Energy Assembler. I came from Singapore, right? So I have a question for both Khun Pek and Mikhail. If now you have a magic wand, right? Okay, what is the first thing your wish you want to fulfill, except money, because we have too many bankers here.
I would be controversial. Are we recording this or not? No, I'm kidding. So I think what we're doing is we think good quality power is green, firm, scalable. Why is that? Because once you have firm, scalable, you can justify interconnection investment. And we think that our project that we're working on together with IFC and ADB is trying to deliver that, right? I think if I have a magic wand, we should have all the government sitting in this room and decide, how can we make it happen? For me, we've been submitting proposal to your government for a very long time, and it's been undecided. And I think Singapore will get the most benefit of this project. It's green, firm, and scalable. It's very hard for us as a private entity, to do that, basically. I think I have all the component, as you said. I think the funding, the ADB, the IFC, I think and APG, Scott, I hope you like our project, which is neat. What could not tell me, we bring the firm power, green, scalable, to Laos border. Now, which country want to take this forward with us? And anyone would do.
Mine is more local, specifically with respect to the Philippines. Coming into this panel, talking about an ASEAN grid, it feels a few steps off for the Philippines specifically, simply because our archipelago hasn't been fully integrated, right? So if I could see anything happen in the next 5 years, It would be seeing redundancies, completion of some of our transmission objectives. We have such a rich country, so much opportunity for growth, but such a difficult time getting power to each of the sectors of the country. So that would probably be the most important thing. If I magic one, it would happen and it doesn't have to happen immediately. 5 years is good enough for me.
So,
okay, just one more last magic one. I want to start construction next year. We have all the money in this room, so.
So thank you all very much. I think it's been a very insightful panel, especially as we have been looking at factors that can policy and otherwise the bankability factor that can actually lead to actual projects on the ground. And I think everybody here in this room is, whether it's from a technical perspective, developer, regulatory, or banking, we all are passionate about this topic because it leads to actual projects that work. So thank you very much, the panel. And so with this, before we end this morning, I would like to welcome Marife Apilado, our Deputy Director General of the Private Sector Operations, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you, Daniel. Distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as I was actually listening to the panel, I remember telling Kunnat and Kunpek that they should write a book about the roller coaster ride of the monsoon story. When you listen to a panel like this, it's like you're reading the summary page at the back of the book. It actually is very highly simplified. But in that book is actually a lot of chapters, and some of those chapters are actually long, arduous, and difficult. But I think that very interesting question on trust, I think it's actually trust and partnership that actually allowed those difficult chapters to move forward. And I particularly like what Kunnat said, that, I mean, I could attest as a person working with Monsoon that Monsoon didn't leave any stone unturned on the most crucial aspects of taking care of everyone and bringing everyone along in this project. I think it's a project that we will be very proud of for many decades to come. So thank you for that very honest and candid discussion on the progress we've seen over the past year about the ASEAN power grid and identifying the major roadblocks we're facing from the regulatory, the political, the ENS technical, also financial point of view. There were many takeaways from the panel, I think, but for me, what we heard today underscores a very palpable truth that the ASEAN power grid is no longer just a conceptual story that we've been hearing about, but is actually making steady progress. How we can accelerate that progress in the future will depend entirely on many of the stakeholders present in this room today, and will come down to how quickly we can resolve the regulatory, the institutional, and environmental challenges that continue to slow projects on the ground. So several themes stood out, and some are worth highlighting once again as we look to take these discussions on APG going forward. So first for me is the licensing and the permitting regime, which remains one of the most decisive bottlenecks and dictates the pace of APG development. Developers on the panel spoke about the complexity of the licensing arrangements, the time to secure approvals, and the uncertainty around the sequencing. So this in turn stems from the fundamental question, what's in it for the host country, especially the exporting country? These issues directly attract project. They actually directly drive the project timelines, the cost of capital, and ultimately the credibility of the regional pipeline. So second for me is the importance of environmental and social requirements. Our safeguards are designed to ensure that communities are protected, to your point, Kunat. Biodiversity is respected, and the projects can withstand scrutiny over decades to come. These fundamental requirements are needed to achieve long-term bankability. But also we recognize the challenges, land acquisition, community engagement, cumulative impacts, and the need for really high-quality engagement of stakeholders. We all need to devise practical solutions to strike the right balance. Third, supply chain is now a strategic variable. The surge in global demand for HVDC cables, transformers, and specialized equipment is impacting project timelines across Asia and beyond. Industry players reminded us that without long-term planning, coordinated procurement, and clear visibility on national pipelines, ASEAN risks being at the back of the global queue. Our panelists have highlighted the need for bespoke financing to unlock private capital. Investors are willing to commit, but at levels where risks are adequately mitigated. To Ganesh's point. Hence, support from the right partners like ADB is essential. We've demonstrated this through the Monsoon Wind Power Project, a project that we will be proud of very much into the future. And we can replicate this success many times across other APG projects, even though Kun Peck doesn't agree with that. But at ADB, we are ready to support this transformational regional initiative. As announced by ADB President Kanda, the bank can readily commit $10 billion over the next decade towards APG. We have also recently launched the Regional Connectivity Fund for Energy in Southeast Asia to finance critical project preparation work for cross-border energy and transmission infrastructure. What we heard today highlights the urgent need for clearer processes, predictable timelines, and stronger coordination across agencies. These are reforms that can unlock real investment for the ASEAN power grid. So I want to end by saying that the progress we make over the next 12 months especially matters a lot. The discussions today show that the barriers are real, but so is the momentum. If ASEAN wants to accelerate the power grid, now is the time to think and act to give investors and other stakeholders the right confidence about the long-term resilience of this initiative. So thank you to our panelists for their insights and to all of you for your engagement. I look forward to continuing this conversation in our afternoon session, which will be very interesting, wherein we will discuss the importance of pumped storage hydropower for grid stability in cross-border energy trade. I hope you all have a good lunch. Thank you.